Good morning. Welcome back here at ESCMID Global TV Live, brought live to you from the studio here in Vienna on the Congress premises. I'm very happy to announce that I have my next live guest here in the studio with me, and it's another keynote lecturer who will be holding his keynote later today in the afternoon. I have with me Professor Guy Thwaites from well, originally from the UK, but living for quite some time now in Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam, where he leads a locally driven research program on infectious diseases in Southeast Asia. Welcome, guys. Very, well, excellent to have you here just prior to you holding your keynote lecture.
Not at all.
This afternoon. So you will be holding a keynote this afternoon on tuberculosis. Where are we now and where should we be?
I am.
And what I would just love to do is just have a little chat about the content of your lecture this afternoon here for our TV viewers, so they can well, have a little taste of what's in store for them, and they can all come and join you at 4:15 to 5:15 in Hall 1 today. So TB, this is your main research focus, I believe.
It's my personal research focus, but I lead a large program, as you said, of infectious diseases research across the whole of Southeast Asia. So I work for Oxford University. We have a research program which is funded mainly by the Wellcome Trust. And we have research units in Vietnam, Indonesia and Nepal. And TB is one of our major areas of research, but we also do work on dengue, we do work on drug-resistant infections and emerging infections as well. But TB is my own personal research pursuit,
So, and TB, well, your talk is titled, Where Are We Now? So where are we now? It's a public health threat, especially in Southeast Asia, but also in other countries, I can imagine. Can you tell us a little bit, how has it evolved over, well, the last couple of decennia?
Yeah, so I'll be covering quite a lot of this in my talk, so I won't want to give too much away. So TB has ravaged the world really for many centuries, and in the wealthier parts of the world, it became much less of a problem in the mid 19th century. But for most of the rest of the world, so the less well-resourced parts of the world, it's still a very major problem. So the continent of Africa, Asia, very many cases, and the total numbers of cases in 2023, according to the WHO, was nearly 11 million. So it's still a very major problem globally, and for a brief period of time, SARS-CoV-2, so COVID, topped the mortality chart, if you like, but unfortunately, TB is back at the top of the mortality chart. So it causes about 1.5 million deaths every year, and we're really not doing that well at reducing those numbers. So I'll go into a little bit of detail about that and describe sort of exactly where we are, really with help from the WHO data. But we've got a long way to go. Yeah,
so I can imagine it's both prevention and control that's a problem at the time, or would you say one is more daunting than the other?
If you look at what happened to TB over the 19th century and into the 20th century, there were very large reductions, and yet we didn't have a vaccine and we didn't have any drugs. So there is a very strong association with poverty, and therefore you can regard this as a social disease as much as a sort of biomedical one. I'm going to talk mostly about the biomedical aspects of it, so the prevention, the diagnosis and the treatment. But I don't think we should get away from the fact that this is a disease of poverty, and that poverty alleviation would have an enormous benefit on it. But I'm not an expert on poverty. I have some expertise on the diagnosis and prevention and treatment, so I will be talking about that during the talk.
Yeah, well, that's good to put it into perspective, but still very important.
Perspective is really important.
Yeah. So what would you say, what are the current unmet needs in TB treatment?
In TB treatment? Well, so the current standard of TB treatment is called, slightly sort of poorly named, it's called short course chemotherapy, which is 6 months of treatment. So that's the standard, 6 months. And whilst that has been enormously effective and has been with us for 50+ years, it's too long, and there is growing problems with resistance to the major drug components of that regimen. So there are two things that people are trying to do. One is to try and shorten treatment to sorts of durations that human beings take regularly and reliably. So anything from less than 2 months would be ideal.
With the same drugs?
Well, we're going to have to develop new drugs because we know that we can't treat everybody with very short courses because people relapse. And that's a function of the disease as well as the drugs. So we're trying to get better drugs that kill bugs quicker and faster. But we're also trying to make sure that we don't develop, that the bacteria don't develop resistance to those antibiotics. So it's a kind of two-sided fight, really. But that's a big challenge. But I think what's the optimism around it is that whereas perhaps, well, during the 1990s and into the early 2000s, there was really almost no activity in terms of TB drug development. Over the last 20 years, there has been a transformation of TB drug development, and it's a really, really exciting time to be in TB now, because the pipeline is as good as it's been since sort of 1955, 1960, where there was this explosion then of new drugs to treat TB, then nothing, and then reawakening in the last 15 years.
The sole reason for developing new drugs is the drug resistance, that is.
Well, that's one of the reasons, because the old drugs are becoming less effective because of resistance. But probably globally, still around 5, maybe maximum of 10%. Depends where we are. In some parts of the world, it's more. People have bugs that are resistant to those antibiotics. But that is steadily increasing, and we can't just sit there and watch it. We have to develop drugs that will replace those that are becoming. That are being lost to resistance. So that's one part of it. But the other part, as I say, is that we've got to try and get regimens that are shorter than 6 months, that are effective in periods of time. Because the problem is if you rely on very long regimens, and 6 months is long, even though it's called short course, people will not always take them. And it's very different for systems. So every country, particularly low-middle income countries, have systems, national TB programs to deliver these treatments. But they're really hard to deliver if you've got 6 months of drugs to give to everybody who's got TB. If you had 2 weeks to give, then the organisation that would be required to make sure that everybody took 2 weeks would be fantastically easier than the current situation. So we've got to overcome resistance, but we've also got to get shorter therapies.
Yeah. So how far is the pipeline?
How far is the pipeline?
Is it looking up?
The pipeline's quite long. It's looking up, No, it's looking as good as it's been for 40 or 50 years.
Okay.
And there are some really interesting initiatives to activate the pipeline. The challenge, though, and this is a challenge across all of infectious diseases, is that the development of new antimicrobials is incredibly expensive. And there really isn't a very good economic model for making money out of antimicrobials. So many drug companies have left antimicrobial development altogether. Fortunately, there are still a few, so GSK, Janssen, Otsuka, for example, just to name a few of the big ones. There are others, have still kept in the game. And they're producing new drugs, interesting new drugs, but they require a mechanism to deliver the trials that tell us how to use these drugs. And we have to innovate. Well, we have to have a clinical trials mechanism, an infrastructure to be able to do these trials.
Exactly.
And these trials have to be done on the whole where there are people with TB. You couldn't do them in Vienna. I'm sure there's a few people with TB in Vienna, but you can't do large-scale clinical trials just in Europe alone, for example. So you have to go to countries where there's a greater burden of disease. And also, that's where the drugs are going to be used. So there's a sort of moral imperative as well to do these trials and to make sure that these drugs are available for for patients in those countries. But setting up the systems to do that, setting up the infrastructure to deliver those trials, which requires considerable expertise, is a big challenge. And if you're producing the next blockbuster cancer drug or the next Ozempic or whatever it is, then you can probably afford to set up quite expensive systems because you're going to recoup your costs. You're not going to recoup your costs on a TB drug in that sense.
No.
So there needs to be a different way of looking at these trials and doing them in countries and being led from countries where TB burden is high, that I think will be something that I will be alluding to. Perhaps more strongly than alluding to in the talk later this afternoon. But I think there's so much potential. The pipeline is really exciting, But how are we going to translate that pipeline into new regimens that will be available for all of the world, most of the world who has high burdens of TB? That's a major, major challenge. It's possible, but it's a major challenge.
Is it? Would you say that the difficult or the multi-drug resistant strains are more clustered in regions of the world such as Southeast Asia and maybe other regions as well, and less so in Europe or Northern America? Or is there a difference? I mean, drug resistance doesn't stick to borders, of course, but do you see different strains over the world?
I mean, yes, you do see different strains over the world. I mean, so drug resistance tends to occur when there is slightly chaotic treatment. Yeah, because resistance emerges when people are not using the drugs as they should. Which is, you know, you've got 6 months of therapy, it's very easy to not use the drugs as they should. So let's not blame anyone. That is difficult things to take. So resistance tends to emerge in chaotic places. So you could probably go to a prison somewhere in Eastern Europe, for example, and you could find very high rates of drug resistance because there tends to be a degree of chaos around those systems, and it makes it difficult for. And there's also a lot of transmission around those systems. Whereas in Southeast Asia, there are problems with drug resistance, but that's really because of the overwhelming numbers of people with TB. So, and the struggle that the national TB programs have in dealing with the numbers of TB. So they try as hard as they possibly can, but it's very, very difficult to ensure that treatment is taken properly when you're dealing with, so in Vietnam, we have around 180,000 new cases a year. In Indonesia, there's 1.1 million cases each year. You know, the resources required for a health system to make sure that everybody is treated well and that resistance doesn't emerge is very, very considerable.
So it's the same problem everywhere,
so it's
globally,
the same problem.
different
so
background.
That's why shorter treatments are really, really required, because it will help everybody ensure that treatment is taken properly and resistance doesn't emerge. Although resistance will always emerge, unfortunately.
Okay, so first we need new drugs, and then we need to really work on the duration of the regimens.
Yeah, and the challenge is really, I mean, the research is fundamental. Obviously, the trials are fundamental. But then there's a big challenge in making sure that once we've defined in our beautiful trials and we publish them in nice journals, that translates to people on the ground getting those drugs in the right way. And, you know, we've seen the emergence of all completely new regimens for multi-drug resistant TB, which have been extraordinarily successful. But certainly, I've witnessed it in Southeast Asia. It's been those drugs have been slow to get to us. You know, we're just about able to get them regularly now, and yet these drugs were shown to be effective 5 years ago. So, you know, there's a big gap.
And this is an economical problem, most likely.
It is. It's economic. As well as practical. I mean, you have to be able to train people to use these new drugs and so forth, and overcome some of the problems. You know, each drug will have its own particular complexity to its use, which people will have to get used to dealing with. People are very used to dealing with the current old ones, and they have considerable complexity actually. So there's a challenge, and you're working with systems that are really, really stretched as well. So that's it's a major problem. But it comes back to poverty and TB. You know, if you don't have the money.
Do you believe there's enough awareness about this? That poverty is really the pressing, unmet need here.
Well, it depends who's aware of it. It's politicians, you need to be aware of it. Because they need to understand that resource needs to be put to this disease.
That's difficult.
But it is difficult because it's not a disease that generally affects the most influential high-income country politicians. Of course, there have been a lot of interest and a lot of a lot of interest in trying to push politicians to make right decisions by the WHO and at the UN and so forth. But the short answer is no, there's not enough awareness of it, because we know how to get rid of this disease. All the tools, they might not be the best tools, but we have the tools. But you know, the numbers are only, the total numbers of TB are just declining very, very slowly at the moment. And in fact have been flat really for the last 3 years. So there's a lot more to
talk about.
There's a lot to talk about. Lots
Yeah.
to talk about.
So are you looking forward to the fireplace session afterwards also?
I am looking forward to the fireplace session.
Yeah.
Yes.
Just have some more short contact interactions on the.
Yes, I think there's an opportunity to ask
More
questions
in-depth,
after
maybe.
after the main talk,
Yeah.
but it's a little bit, you know, standing up in front of 3,000 people to ask a question
Can be a little daunting.
Can be a bit daunting. So I suspect I'll get more questions after the for the Fireside talk, which should be very nice.
Well, there's enough information to be shared, if I hear you correctly. So thank you so much, Guy, for coming here and taking the time on the day of your keynote lecture to come here to our ESCMID Global TV studio and telling our viewers some more about the talk you will be holding later on. So if you want to join Guy Thwaites at his keynote lecture on TB, where we are now and where we should be, that is at 4:15 in Hall 1. I cannot remind you enough. Even if you're following the Congress from at home, you can log in on the platform and follow Guy's keynote lecture live this afternoon. Please do so. We will be taking a short break here at ESCMID Global TV, but we will be back at 11 o'clock with a next keynote lecturer at this year's ESCMID Global 2025. Hope to see you then.